A few weeks ago, I made a video with the top 5 prospects in the Islanders system. So I wanted to go back and check how my model supports former prospects who've now either gone on to better things or not. Hit that subscribe button, don't miss a video. Also go to Twitter, follow @TLOMitch. That's me. Don't miss any breaking information about Islanders prospects or game coverage I've yet to cover on the channel. I want to thank subscriber Bob Henry for suggesting this video. A few videos back when I did my first top 5, he suggested that if I want to test how my model works, go back 5-6 years and check to see how that performs with some of those prospects we had in the system then. Well, I didn't want to do it the first iteration of my model because I wasn't really happy with the output. I'm a little bit happier with what this more recent model has, so I want to test it with some prospects that did pass through the system and are now at the NHL level, just to see how close or far or what lessons I could learn from what I see. To test my model, I looked at 4 former prospects. I looked at Anders Lee, Brock Nelson, Devon Toews, and Michael Dal Colle. And the reason I took those 4 players is we have a late round draft pick that turned into a fantastic NHLer. Did that come out of nowhere? We had a first round pick in Brock Nelson going, okay, well, does that kind of follow things there? And then I've got a defenseman in Devon Toews who's also a later pick, right, and took his time from college to the AHL before getting to the NHL. Do we see that kind of steady rise, or what do we see there? And then Michael Dal Colle, because was it predictable that we would see what we saw at the NHL level? Was that in the cards or not? So let's look at each of those players and see how close or far I was and what we could learn from the model that I've got. So the first player I wanted to look at was Anders Lee. And like every other prospect, all I'm doing here is I'm looking at the first 4 years before he became an established NHLer. I'm not looking at afterwards, just what do the 4 years look like before he became an established NHLer. And for Anders Lee, looking at his NHLE before becoming an NHL pro in 14-15, he was on pace or projected to be a 24-point player, which is fine. He had a good season at the AHL the year before with 41 points in 54 games, translates to a 24-point player at the NHL level, which is, all right, that's something, but he does not become a 24-point player at the NHL level. He goes off and scores 25 goals and 41 points in his first full year at the NHL. So there's clearly something off here in my model. Now, when I'm looking at the NHLE here, I'm not factoring in growth, although you see my growth factor there. He has a 1.15 growth factor because he takes his time, right? He goes from the NCAA where he's 13 points and then 14 points, and then he explodes at the AHL level. So perhaps when we see that growth, that consistent growth, and then the explosion when he gets to the pros, you go like, all right, maybe there's something a little bit more here that we need to take notice of. The lesson learned from Anders Lee is that when a player goes from specifically the college scene to the pros, that being the AHL, and there's that explosion of growth, right? Like 3.68 NHLE, you're going like, all right, maybe there's something we need to take or account for here when we project where a player could be at the NHL level. Now, remember that lesson learned from Anders Lee? Brock Nelson kind of throws that out of the window because when you look at his NHLE and growth from going from prep school to NCAA to the AHL, there's consistent growth there. And specifically when it gets to the AHL, where he grows by 2.85 NHLE, there's significant growth there. But the NHLE that I have is dead on. Dead on. So in his final year at the AHL level before going pro, or sorry, not going pro, but going to the NHL with the Islanders, he is projected to be a 25-point player at the NHL level. And when he gets to the NHL the next year, guess what? 26 points. That's pretty close, right? Like, yeah, the rounding doesn't even jump up to 26, but to be that close from 25 to 26, there's something there. You're going, that makes a lot of sense. He did what he was expected to do. And again, there's consistent growth there from Brock Nelson, right? Where he goes from prep school to the NCAA, you got 0.4 growth. And then from NCAA the year afterwards, 1.9, 2.8 when he goes to the AHL. Consistent growth. It shows that there's a good player there, But when it gets to performing at the NHL level, the NHL here does very, very well to project the type of player he will be, at least in the first year. It's not to say this is what he's going to be forever, but it's based off of what he did at the AHL level or the very previous level. This is what it translates to at the NHL level, and this does remarkably well. Lesson learned here is that the NHLE, or the translation factors, work. And yes, there's growth there like Anders Lee, but maybe we don't have to pay that much attention to it because really the picture it's painting us works. Now I want to get to Devon Toews and look at defensemen. And when it comes to defensemen, my NHLE changes a little bit. I like to change it just a bit because I don't find it's fair to equate defensemen and forwards on production and at the same rate, because it's not really the same thing. So I like to add a little 1.6 point inflator. And the reason I do that is because defensemen score, or forwards score, on average 1.6 times more than than defensemen. So to kind of level the playing field, that's why I put that 1.6. And so when you look at Devon Toews, his final year, he had an NHLE of 23.39 in the AHL before going full-time in the NHL. And when you add that 1.6 inflator, that kind of goes up to 37 points at the NHL level. His first full year, he puts up a pace of 31 points at the NHL level. Of course, that's not the exact return that he's had that year, but he didn't play a full year, right? So what I did is I paced it out over the season, over a full 82-game season, to give us a kind of picture of what kind of defenseman he was in that first year. So to fall 6 points back of the projection to actual, that's fair. I'm okay with that. Again, these projections from NHLE are never going to be, or never intended to be, dead set exact. Like when he gets to the NHL level, this is exactly what he's going to do. What it tries to do is paint you a picture of what he did at that level should translate to this at the NHL level. And to be 6 points off is pretty fair. Of course, this isn't saying his ceiling is 37 points. As we know, Devon Toews can do more. As we saw with Anders Lee, as we saw with Brock Nelson, they could do more. It's at that point, this is what they can do. So my model still kind of works here, specifically when I add the 1.6 inflator for defensemen, because it gives you that sense of, it levels the playing field for forwards and defensemen, and it gives you the overall view of what they could do at the NHL level when they step there year one. So far our model works, and there's very little to tinker with as far as I can see. The fourth and final player I want to look at is Michael Dal Colle, and I'm calling him my control group because we know it didn't go well. So if the model is high, we know it actually happened, and so why was it high, and what can we learn from that? So let's bring up the NHLE. He should have been, or not should have been, but his final season at the AHL was effectively a 32-point season at the NHL level. His point per game pace, 34 points in 34 games, it gives you what it should have been, a 32-point player when he progresses to the NHL level. Of course, it can go up from there, but he's already a 32-point player. And as we know, he was not and has never been a 32-point player at the NHL level. When he made that jump to the NHL the very next year, he put up what was effectively 15 points, right? I'm pacing that out over a full 82-game season. So what happened to go from 32 points to 15? Where did I lose half of the production? And again, the model doesn't change, right? Like nothing has changed here, but what can we see from the model to be like, oh, that should have been a red flag? And what I think is the growth rate, right? You go from plus 2.9 to negative 1.8 to plus 7.4, right? That is a wild swing of highs and lows and highs again. Maybe there should be some sort of red flag system to say, like, you got an MDC curve going on here, Mitch. You should take whatever the model is spitting out with a significant grain of salt. So when I look at my model and I look at past results like Anders Lee, Brock Nelson, Devon Toews, and Michael Dal Colle, I think the big takeaway here is when I look at Michael Dal Colle and I say, like, look for those MDC curves, look for those wild swings from the highs and the lows in back-to-back-to-back seasons. That should add a red flag, some sort of cursor to say, like, yes, this player did have a good year, but you gotta look out because there's a possibility this is full of pitfall and peril. Thank you for following. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that button. And if you have already, thank you, thank you, thank you.